I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, in a historic moment for Europe, NATO fighter jets shoot down Russian drones over Poland in the first ever direct engagement between the Western alliance and Moscow. We assess the global reaction and what it means, before asking how Russia is manipulating the information space to conceal its crimes today and shape opinion.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 10th of September, 3 years and 200 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and Peter Pomerantsev, Chief Editor and co-founder of the Reckoning Project, as well as Scott Martin, an international lawyer at Global Rights Compliance. But first, over to Dom for a summary of the military situation and the crisis in Poland.
Thanks, Francis. Hello, everyone. So no surprise, we're going to start with the incursion into Polish airspace yesterday. NATO jets shot down Russian drones that repeatedly violated Poland's airspace in an overnight bombardment of Ukraine, we are told this morning. Polish, Dutch and Italian fighter aircraft were scrambled to intercept 19 drones as citizens, particularly in the east of Poland, were told to stay at home. It marks the most serious clash between Russia and the NATO alliance since the start of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, arguably taking the conflict into uncharted territory. Politicians and analysts believe this to be a deliberate attempt by the Kremlin to test NATO's response, both militarily, technically and politically. Footage showed the damage to a home struck by a drone in eastern Poland, with its roof missing, no known casualties. I've not seen any reports of casualties in Poland. Donald Tusk, Poland's Prime Minister, said last night we experienced a violation of Polish airspace by a significant number of Russian drones. He denounced what he called the large-scale provocation. And speaking to Parliament, he said he'd requested Article 4 of the NATO treaty to be invoked. Now, Article 4 means they want all the alliance members to come together to discuss an issue. It is not the same as Article 5, which is potentially taking military action. So Article 4 was invoked at the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. It draws everyone together for a discussion. It in and of itself does not necessarily immediately lead to military action. As I say, last used at the outbreak of the full-scale invasion. What it means is consultations are then held to determine whether the territorial integrity, political independence or security of a member country has been threatened. Mr. Tusk said the fact that these drones, which pose a security threat, were shot down changes the political situation. Therefore, Allied consultations took the form of a formal request to activate Article 4 of the NATO treaty. He carried on, he said, this is not just a war for Ukrainians, this is a confrontation that Russia has declared against the entire free world. Now, seeking to reassure understandably nervous citizens in his country and beyond, he said, there is no reason to claim Poland is in a state of war, but the situation is significantly more dangerous than all previous ones. He said the prospect of large military conflict is closer than at any time since the Second World War. He added that a large number of drones flew in from Belarus, and the last one was shot down at 06:45 hours local time this morning. The operational command of the Polish Armed Forces urged residents to stay at home, with 3 eastern regions at particular risk. In a statement, they said this is an act of aggression that posed a real threat to the safety of our citizens. 4 Polish airports briefly halted operations, the main Chopin Airport and Modlin Airport in Warsaw, Lublin to the east and Rezov to the southeast. Interesting, Belarus, Moscow's key ally in Europe, said it had shot down drones over its airspace after Poland said that some had flown over Polish airspace as well. Belarus's army said it had destroyed drones that had lost their track as a result of what it said was electronic jamming and interception by both Kyiv and Moscow. So they're trying to play both sides. Belarus did not say if the drones that it shot down were Russian or Ukrainian, but said it had informed Poland's Air Force about drones that were heading towards the country. The EU chief Ursula von der Leyen said just today we've seen a reckless and unprecedented violation of Poland and Europe's airspace by more than 10 Russian Shahed drones. She was speaking to EU lawmakers. Donald Tusk later put the number of 19 on it. But Ms von der Leyen carried on saying Europe stands in full solidarity with Poland. She said that the bloc was working on a new sanctions package to pressure Russia to come to the negotiation table because that's worked so well in the past. Now, Reuters have reported a source saying that NATO is not treating the incident as an attack, but as an intentional incursion. The source speaking to Reuters said it was the first time NATO aircraft have engaged potential threats in Allied airspace. They said NATO's Patriot air defence systems in the region had detected the drones but not engaged them. However, we believe Polish F-16 jets, Dutch F-35s and Italian AWACS, that's the Airborne Warning and Control System, the kind of air traffic control in the sky, surveillance planes and mid-air refuelling aircraft jointly operated by NATO were involved in the overnight operation, the source told Reuters. The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is expected to pen out a statement soon. British forces are not thought to have been involved last night. President Zelensky said Russia used 415 drones and 40 missiles in attacks on Ukraine overnight, adding that at least 8 Iranian-made Shahed drones had been aimed towards Poland. He said an extremely dangerous precedent for Europe, a strong response is needed, and it can only be a joint response by all partners, Ukraine, Poland, all Europeans, the United States. Then Andrei Sybiha, Ukraine's foreign minister, said Russian drones flying into Poland during the attack on Ukraine shows Putin's sense of impunity keeps growing because he was not properly punished for his previous crimes. Putin just keeps escalating, expanding his war and testing the West. Mr. Sybiha called on Kyiv's allies to harden their response to Russia to avoid more Russian missiles and drones flying, as he said, even further into Europe. Andreas Kubilius, the EU's defence commissioner, said the EU must develop a drone wall, his words, along the eastern flank. Writing on X, he said, once again, Russia tests frontier states, EU and NATO. We shall work together with member states, frontier countries and Ukraine. Russia will be stopped. And in the last couple of hours, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, said a full assessment is ongoing. Of course, whether it was intentional or not, it is absolutely reckless. It is absolutely dangerous. He said the full assessment is ongoing. He continued, and to Putin, my message is clear. Stop the war in Ukraine. Stop the escalating war, which he is now basically mounting on innocent civilians and civilian infrastructure. Stop violating Allied airspace and know that we stand ready, that we are vigilant and we will defend every inch of NATO territory. Mr. Rutte concluded saying, I think what we've seen last night was a very successful reaction by NATO and allies, including, of course, Poland itself, but also the Dutch, the Italians and the Germans. I'm really impressed. So, of course, we always have to make sure that we are one step ahead, but I think last night showed that we are able to defend every inch of NATO territory, including its airspace. Matthew Whitaker, the US ambassador to NATO, said we stand by our NATO allies in the face of these airspace violations and will defend every inch of NATO territory. So that's the news for last night. I did note, though, I saw this a little while ago. I'll bring it to you. So the online news site Babel, Ukrainian online news site Babel, had a story 2 days ago reporting how Ukraine and Poland have just jointly, in the last few weeks, reburied the remains of 42 victims of the Volyn tragedy. Those are the mass killings between 1943 and 1945. Still causes huge division between Kyiv and Warsaw. Now, with the first exhumation and joint reburial ceremony taking place in 10 years, both sides are talking about a breakthrough, reporter Yulia Hiria says. And she says Russian propaganda exploits historical events to undermine Polish-Ukrainian relations. So I'm just wondering if the incursion last night into Polish airspace was more than a test and an up yours to NATO. I think it's very interesting that it happened just after this joint act over such a painful part of Polish and Ukrainian history. Put a link to the Babel article in the episode notes. A couple more points to bring you up to date before we discuss the incident last night in greater detail. The casualties from that strike reported yesterday in Donetsk on the mobile pension distribution point has risen to 24, with 19 others injured. These are mostly elderly people who were queuing to get their pensions. A glide bomb attack against the village of Yarova took place while government officials were distributing pensions to civilians. That was part of attacks across the country that left 29 civilians killed, 34 injured in the last 24 hours, regional authorities said today. Ukraine's Air Force said Russia had launched 415 drones, 42 cruise missiles, and 1 Iskander-M ballistic missile overnight. 21 drones and 16 missiles got through, hit 17 locations across the country. The deadliest strikes were in Donetsk, where 28 people were killed, mostly in that strike against the Eurova, and 20 injured, Governor Vadim Flashkin said. And just finally, Ombre Intelligence, the maritime global risk management firm, said that Ukrainian forces conducted a maritime drone strike on the port of Novorossiysk in Russia. According to Russia-affiliated media channels, alarms were sounded in the early hours of the morning. At the time of writing the report, Ombre says that Russian media saying the attack had been repelled. They say that AIS data, the tracking data, suggests 17 merchant vessels were in Novorossiysk port at the time of the attack, although a lot of vessels do turn off their tracking, their transponders, so they're not highlighted on the spectrum. Anyway, we will keep an eye on that. That's us very quickly up to date, Francis.
Thanks very much, Dom. Where to start, really? Make no mistake, everyone. Today should be considered a day of real historic importance. Anyone who has become numbed to the frequency of Russian aerial bombardments on Ukraine and the occasional stray drone into Poland or Romania needs to realise it is exactly that creeping acceptance of violations which Moscow benefits from. It is probing NATO, just as we thought it would, and in a manner that enables it plausible deniability. They can claim it was unintentional while testing Western resolve and defence. Polish skies roaring with NATO fighter jets, emergency broadcasts to the nation, drones striking homes in rural villages beyond the threshold of Article 5. This is unprecedented. Imagine if this had happened before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and you can begin to realise how much this war, as we've often argued, is changing the moral architecture of the world we all inhabit, making it a far more dangerous one. Warsaw, understandably, is up in arms, as Dom said, with its prime minister even going so far as to call it the closest the day has been to open conflict since World War II. Some more reactions. French President Macron calling it simply unacceptable. Lithuania, that Russia is deliberately expanding its aggression, posing an ever-growing threat to Europe. Czechia, that Moscow threatens all of Europe and systematically probes how far it can go. Even Hungary's Viktor Orban said Budapest stood in full solidarity with Poland. Many are saying that if NATO does not make a firm boundary for Russia today as a result of this violation, then it will happen again, and possibly far more seriously. Now, Professor Phillips O'Brien of the University of St Andrews, who we interviewed on the podcast last week, has written an excellent piece of analysis this morning. And as he writes, we are witnessing the constant failure of NATO states to accurately assess their security concerns and national interests. Last night's attack shows how the states of the alliance have not bothered to prepare properly for not only future war, but the war that is staring them right in the face now. Moreover, their constant weakness to this point has emboldened Russia to flagrantly violate NATO airspace while reinforcing the idea NATO states have no idea how to look after their own security. They cannot even call an attack. And he goes on to underscore that in terms of what Ukraine experiences on a nightly basis, this is tiny, just 14 drones, so 2% of the 4, 5 or even 600 Ukraine often suffers. And this was without the combination of cruise or ballistic missiles. He also emphasises the slow response time. These systems were fired from Russia and had to travel over Ukraine and partly Belarus to reach Poland in the first place. They should have been identified as possible threats much earlier and defence preparations put in place with plenty of time. The fact NATO had to rely on extremely expensive systems to do what the Ukrainians are doing at a fraction of the cost and could not or would not even shoot all the Russian attacking drones down reveals how unprepared NATO really is. Now, while European NATO scrambles to form a collective position, the attitude in the US seems pretty nonplussed. As it was all happening last night, President Trump and the Secretary of State of Defense, Pete Hegseth, were on a walkabout of Washington to underscore how much safer it is since they sent in the National Guard. And they were rather dismissive of the journalists who were asking them about the crisis taking place in Poland. And thus far, there have been no statements that release any strong words at all. Now, many are saying that this incident is precisely what happens when you have a weak United States. Some saying that it would have been an unthinkable act before Trump took office. Now, I'd argue that the Iskander cruise missile, which hit the Ukrainian government building last week and apparently failed to detonate, was another such incident. It wasn't a drone which got shot down or diverted from its course, it seems. The evidence would suggest it was a deliberate targeting. Furthermore, according to the Ukrainian Sanctions Commissioner, the missile contained more than 35 foreign-made components, including ones made in the US, Japan, the UK and Switzerland. More evidence of the failure of Western sanctions and strengths on these issues. Now, meanwhile, Romania, Czechia, Hungary jointly dismantled a Belarusian espionage network operating across Europe to recruit agents and collect sensitive intelligence. Among those exposed was a former deputy of Moldova's intelligence service who allegedly passed secret information to the Belarusian KGB, who, as we all know, are close allies of Moscow. Czech authorities emphasised that the espionage network was able to expand primarily thanks to the ability to move freely across Europe. Now, that critique has been made countless times by concerned officials in relation to Russians in Europe, who, given the hybrid warfare being conducted, many believe is a very foolhardy policy at the present moment. But Dom, in the spur of the moment a few weeks ago, when we were reporting on James Rothwell's story of how the Kremlin is using nuns at a remote convent in the Baltics to spread pro-Russian propaganda for its hybrid war in Europe, you created that game, Breach or Reach, which became an instant fan favourite, putting forward hypothetical scenarios of how Russia might break Article 5 with plausible deniability, undermining Article 5's credibility. I think it may be time for another round. So what do you make of this incident, Dom, in that context?
Yeah, so we were talking not entirely flippantly a few weeks ago with the whole breach or reach thing, positing a number of ways that Article 5 might be tested. Would that be enough to trigger it? Of course, it isn't binary. It's not one episode, or very few things are absolutely clear and unequivocally a breach of Article 5. It is a sliding scale and a discussion, and allies, the NATO allies, working by unanimity. That's why Putin's putting so much effort into undermining NATO through Hungary and Slovakia and elsewhere. It is difficult to say whether or not this would be deemed a breach of Article 5, because that's just my opinion, your opinion, everyone else's opinion who's listening to this. I do know that Mark Galeotti, the historian and commentator, says that he suggests it's neither an attack on NATO nor an accident, but he says it's a probe and a warning, a bit as you were suggesting the other day. Warnings with missiles hitting Ukrainian government buildings and that may deliberately have not been armed. What is it? It's extremely serious, firstly. I do note, you may remember November 2015, Turkish Air Force F-16 shot down a Russian jet, a Sukhoi Su-24, around the Syria-Turkey border. Turkey said the Russian jet had flown into Turkish airspace for some time and ignored warnings. Russia says it wasn't, but they shot it down. And guess what? Russia hadn't gone back. Russia's not tested Turkey again. They've not pushed against that border again. There have been no further incursions or anything like it. Like all bullies, once you punch them on the nose, they tend to take you seriously and they don't come back for more. So this, I think, was a probe and a test, as I said earlier, to see what the technical response was, the political response from NATO and the political response in the nations that make up NATO. It was also a test of the military preparedness. It was only a while ago, some time ago, we were talking about a potential sky shield, NATO nations flying from NATO territory to affect air power over Ukraine, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so that got roundly shouted down. But now if you've got NATO airspace that is violated like this, we don't know exactly what the response was. Some may have been shot down, some may not and have just landed. So we don't quite know how good the NATO response was. But you can bet your ass that Russia is now going over all the telemetry and looking at all the operational reports about what may or may not have happened. Beyond whether or not you think this was a breach of Article 5, that's largely irrelevant. It's whether or not the North Atlantic Council, the political side of NATO, thinks it was and therefore act accordingly. But this was certainly a test. I think it was intentional. I don't think this was an accident. No, colour me shocks when Russia says, there's no evidence, it was Russian drones. As soon as they open their mouth, they're lying, I think. That's my view. You may differ. Serious, yes. A test, yeah. Breach, don't know. Arguably irrelevant. But I just remember 2015 when they tried it on with Turkey and Turkey shot down a Russian jet, and Russia did not come back for more. And I do hope NATO adopts a very similar response to this.
Thanks very much, Dom. It does feel like another of those days where it will be considered an opportunity for a strong response, an opportunity for a profound shift in how the West is approaching this. And yet we are simply not at the moment seeing any evidence that there's going to be some drastic shift in policy. I think many European leaders will be particularly concerned to see the deafening silence at the moment, really, from Washington, in contrast to perhaps what might have been expected under the Biden administration, or indeed in most administrations prior to the one that we are seeing now. And just on that, Dom, before I go to our guests for today, how concerned do you think Europe should be as a consequence of this response or lack thereof in Washington to what's happened?
Donald Tusk, he's not a guy known for hyperbole. He says this is the most serious incident and the closest we've been to war since the end of the Second World War. I think we've got to listen to these words and take them seriously. And he's saying that in public, so I imagine he's using probably some more colourful language behind closed doors. This is a serious moment. What more evidence Europe, NATO, the West, whatever, but let's focus on Europe. What more evidence do you need? You've got internet cable cutting. You've got incendiary devices on DHL planes. You've got ammunition warehouses in Czech Republic exploding. You've got election interference. You've got Sergei Skripal, an attempted assassination with nerve agent poisoning. When we talk about grey zone attacks and hybrid attacks, we use Russia as an example, as if we say to each other, look, you know what Russia does? Well, that's what we mean by a grey zone attack. How much clearer does it have to be? Europe, you are under attack. Europe, you are under attack. Europe, you are under attack. I could go on all day. It might not be the divisions of Third Shock Army swarming over the North German plain. That's not what it's like anymore, guys. Europe, you are under attack from Russia. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? There's no hiding now. You can't say, it was an accident, these things just arrived, or, I'm going to shake my fist and you just wait, here's some sanctions, going to hit you with the sanctions, don't make me pull out the sanctions again. Europe, you are under attack. What are you going to do about it?
Thanks, Dom, and very much interested in your reactions around the world to what's taken place, particularly if you're in Poland. As I was saying earlier on, the fact is there were emergency broadcasts around this, sirens sounded, and homes have been destroyed. This is a big deal. And I would say that anybody who's in a country that hasn't faced something like this, and obviously that is the majority in Europe, imagine if it was your country that had just had stray missiles, stray drones land and crash in your hometown or your village, and imagine the reaction that would have, particularly in the United States if this occurred. This is really serious, and I'm just very aware of the fact that it's very easy for us to all have become anaesthetised to the idea of regular bombardments in Europe, and yes, the idea that missiles just occasionally stray across one border or another. This is not normal, and this is very serious indeed. But let's now go to our guests for today. Very pleased to welcome back to the podcast Peter Pomerantsev, Chief Editor and co-founder of The Reckoning Project, and for his first appearance, Scott Martin, an international lawyer at Global Rights Compliance. They're here to discuss a joint report by those bodies on Russian disinformation operations in Ukraine. I'm going to cut to Scott Martin to talk a little bit more about this, because it's a report that's an in-depth examination of information alibis, that distinct form of disinformation employed by Russia in armed conflicts. Scott, there's lots of legal implications of that, which we'll get into in a moment. But could you just summarise, please, for us the scope of the report?
Hi, and thanks for having me along with Peter. Yes, and report, it's actually a structure for how to put a cognizable claim to the International Criminal Court on prosecuting propagandists when their words actually help contribute to crime. And so the steps we took, and we've done this, of course, in the Ukrainian context, but the Russian leadership have used information alibis in a range of different jurisdictions, and particularly in Syria, as we analyzed in our report. There's a strategy that Russia uses as in its information operations alongside their military operations, where they preemptively disseminate disinformation in an effort to indicate that another actor, in this case the Ukrainian army, was set to perpetrate the crime that they later perpetrated. And so maybe I'll just step back and use the Kakhovka Dam, which I'm sure your listeners are familiar with, as an example. And in this context, as this took place in June 2023, but as far back as approximately October 2022, there were principally the diplomatic corps senior leadership were propagating this idea that the Ukrainians were preparing, because it served them militarily, to attack the dam. And this was a message that was shared by Mr. Nebenzia, who, of course, is the permanent representative to the UN for Russia, by Maria Zakharova, spokeswoman in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Sergei Lavrov, of course, the foreign minister, was involved to some degree, and a range of other actors. And so when the collective message was then put into the international and domestic media sphere, and the attack later happened, they just point back at these previous warnings that they were delivering generously to the international community.
Thank you. And when we're looking at the legal implications of this, Scott, that is, of course, your major expertise in relation to this. How do we even begin to approach liability of this kind of disinformation warfare, which, of course, has been rampant and is being deployed today, not only in Ukraine, but also in Europe more widely?
Sure. And I guess as a preliminary comment, most propaganda is acceptable, widely used by everybody in a range of different spheres, including armed conflict. Second, we approached this as my job is as a human rights activist and supporter. And so the idea that certain propaganda can be prosecutable does need to account for the fact that it needs to be seen as an exception to the general idea that people should be free to express themselves, even during an armed conflict. So where we actually looked, and just to preface how our solution came about, we're not presenting a renegade notion here. If you look at the jurisprudence of the international criminal tribunals, the idea is widely used that you can punish certain forms of disinformation. And where we connected information alibis and other disinformation operations by the Russian leadership is when it's used to conceal the perpetration of an international crime, when it obstructs through the obstruction of investigations, through obstructing accountability mechanisms, that can be seen as an actionable claim at the International Criminal Court under it. Forgive the legalese, but I'll just use it once, under Article 25.3d of the Rome Statute. And so if you look at the Kakhovka Dam example, and you consider that these various actors, senior actors out in the international arena at some of the biggest international organizations in the world, admonishing the international population that Ukraine was planning a provocation against its own people or to attack its own object, what it was doing is contributing to the perpetration of a crime justiciable by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which is a range of different crimes, perhaps the attack against a civilian object, the damage caused to the environment, as well as damage caused to properties, houses, and the deaths of a certain number of people. And so that disinformation, that propaganda in parallel with the military operations could be seen to be having made a contribution to the perpetration of that crime. And so if it can reach the critical threshold of significance, which is determined and adjudicated on a case-by-case basis, you can argue validly, and it's widely understood that you can argue this, propagandist having perpetrated a crime.
Thank you, Scott, for that overview. Peter, I wonder whether you can comment on this a little further in relation to the events beyond Ukraine. Disinformation, as we were saying earlier on, is not only going to be rampant in today's context of the events taking place in Poland, but it's been rampant really for years, ever since the start of the full-scale invasion. And I wonder, when we're looking at the legal implications of this, but also just in terms of the practical responses that could be made by European governments, is enough being done? And what more can be done than's being done at the moment?
Look, I think I'd actually make the frame even longer, and I go all the way back to Nuremberg, where, I know the readers of my last book will know this scene when at Nuremberg, when we tried to put the head of the Reichsradio on trial. He basically, one of Goebbels' leading propagandists, and probably the closest proxy we had for Goebbels there. When we put him on up at Nuremberg, he said, look, I'm just a propagandist. What do I know? I don't know anything about these crimes. I'm not responsible. I just use words. Goebbels gave me a piece of paper and I said it. And he was found not guilty. And usually, frankly, propagandists are found not guilty. It's quite rare for them to say something so egregious and so intentional that you can catch them out for inciting genocide. That's actually the exception. That's not the rule. And frankly, when it comes to disinformation, as Scott said, we might not like it, but most of it is completely legal. So there is always, when you're saying something can be done, there's actually only so much that can be done if we're talking about the legal sphere. You had moves made against RT in Europe because, and this was upheld by a French court, they were pursuing, essentially questioning the sovereignty of Ukraine. So that's how RT was taken down. But look, we live in a world where for Russia to use other propagandists that are not in the broadcast space. Why I think this approach is great is that it gets us out of this very unhelpful framing of trying to think about types of speech. Yeah, is this disinformation? Is this, incitement to genocide? That's not the way we're approaching it. We're approaching it from a crime. The crime is physical. A hospital has been bombed. A dam has been exploded, causing an ecocide. What has been the role of propagandists to prepare that? Yeah, so we're talking about information operations that are preparing and laying the ground for a crime. And then you're charging them with essentially a form of aiding and abetting that crime. Why I think that's productive. In today's digital world, you can track that. Yeah, you can see how a campaign has been building preemptively. So before the event, you can see how, and we do this in the report, you can see how the Russian campaign builds before the event, pushing out very intentional narratives to obscure the authors of the crime. Yeah, for them to do that, they must know about the crime. They must be at least dimly aware of it. And that makes them part of the crime. So it's a very different approach. I think it's more, look, there's a lot of controversy in Britain as well about very foolish attacks to try to limit free speech. That's the wrong way to go about this. What you have to do is start with an actual obvious war crime and then see, do the propagandists aid and abet it? That, I think, is a much wiser way to go, and we could think about that more generally.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, it's a very interesting aspect of the report, is it underscores the importance, as you say, of upholding freedom of expression while also recognising the need for legitimate restrictions to prevent its abuse in information warfare. And that's a distinction we've tried to make on this podcast many times. And there are, of course, for obvious reasons, those who are very sensitive around the idea of freedom of speech being absolutely paramount. And of course, we would share that. But there is a difference between freedom of speech and deliberately malicious designed disinformation, which, as you say, causes physical harm. And I think it's a very interesting approach to begin with the act of physical harm and work backwards. And as I say, we will link to the piece in the show notes and come back to you both in a moment for your final thoughts of today. But I'm going to come to Dom now on this historic day, as we were saying earlier on, for many reasons. And of course, do stay with us this week as we process it further. Dom, where do you want to leave listeners? Has there been more going on while we've been on air?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. I'm tracking a few news sites. It's been reported across a number of places that the drones in Poland were Garan 2, as in the Russian-made variants of the Iranian Shahed 136, 139 family. I've just got a note here from the International Institute for Strategic Studies that say their research team think that they were Gerberer drones. Now, they are significantly cheaper than the Garan 2 or the Shaheds. The primary use of the Gerberer is decoys to overwhelm air defences, but they can also be used for electronic reconnaissance. They can be armed with a warhead, although they are more usually used as decoys and, like I say, electronic recce. That would, without trying to make the facts fit the argument type thing, but it would make sense if Russia was testing NATO's airspace to not have these things fitted with high explosive warheads. So that may be something to bear in mind, but we don't know. I just offer that for thought. However, my final thought, and we've spoken about this numerous times in the last couple of years, I think, surely now is the time for NATO to push air defence assets right up against the border of Belarus and against the border with Ukraine, across the river, etc., covering the border area, but with clear orders and publicly expressed intent to shoot down any air threats heading into NATO's airspace, including those that may be heading towards NATO's airspace, even if they are still many kilometres inside Ukraine. Now, that might have the accidental effect of protecting some parts of Ukraine. NATO can say with absolute legitimacy now and without any question whatsoever that there has been a threat to NATO airspace. They do need to defend it. And if by some unlucky happenstance Ukraine enjoys some protection from these air defence assets, so be it. Let Russia make the case for that kind of action being unfair. I think that would be an appropriate and proportionate response to what's happened here. And if Russian drones and perhaps other air munitions in the west of Ukraine happen to be shot down by NATO air defence assets, fearing that they are going to head for Polish or Romanian airspace, then so be it. Let's see what Russia says about that.
Thank you very much, Dom, for your reflections there. Scott, where would you like to leave listeners?
I guess just with the idea that it's not all that unusual to prosecute disinformation in the international criminal legal system. Following the jurisprudence that's previously established, we have the Mladic case, the famous General Ratko Mladic of the Republika Srpska, Karadzic. Both these individuals, as well as many others in the Rwandan tribunals, the Libya cases at the ICC, the Kenyan cases at the ICC, if disinformation helps to, or propaganda helps to contribute in a significant way to the perpetration of a crime of individuals acting according to a common purpose, it can be prosecuted. And so while speech must be understood as a core human right, there's also legitimate limitations on it. Everyone knows you can't scream fire in a crowded theater. You can't incite violence from your supporters. And you also ought not use information alibis to assist in the covering up or concealment of a crime during an active conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Peter, as our guest today, you have a final word.
I think we are in such a state of confusion about how to approach the information environment. And there are so many mistakes being made in the way that we approach this challenge. And I really hope our report and also really focuses attention on the delineation between people's rights, including Russia's right to say all sorts of horrible things, which frankly, Lavrov has that right, for example, or Nebezhnya, who's a very big player in our report. And something very different, which is the perpetration of crimes and the role of propagandists who are essentially part of the security system, part of the military system, part of the intelligence system, who are consciously aiding and abetting crimes. That's something completely different. And hopefully we can start to delineate that as in a way we understand this whole space.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine. and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow the Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.